We continue in our study on Daniel. This morning, we'll read from chapter 3. If you're able, please stand, and we'll read the entirety of the chapter, which will be the basis of the sermon this morning. Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And when the satraps and the prefects and the governors and counselors, treasurers, justices, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered in for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and the herald proclaimed loudly, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, languages, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace." And therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." And then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? You do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you were ready when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to him, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, we will not serve your God or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it is usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent, and the furnace overheated, and the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And all 3 of these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the burning fiery furnace. And then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up in haste, and he declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men into the burning fire?" And they answered and said, "True, O king." And he answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High, come out, come here." And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. That's the reading of God's word. You may be seated. Let's pray. Father, we plead with you that you would grant that posture without which no one can understand truth, especially from your scriptures, namely that we might have reverence and awe before them. In Jesus' name, amen. The novel Silence by Shishaku Endo is a haunting book. Mr. Endo is esteemed as one of the greatest novelists in Japan, 19 books to his name. He's been called Japan's Graham Greene. His novel Silence was recently rendered into a motion picture by Martin Scorsese, who seems almost obsessed with the novel, probably because of his professed Roman Catholicism. The theme of silence is integral to the story. As a Christian, the movie is very hard to watch. The book is even more difficult to read because it's basically about these Portuguese missionaries that in the 17th century go to Japan to try and strengthen the faith of the Christians there. However, many of them were eventually martyred or forced to apostatize. The book's main character is a gentleman named Sebastian Rodriguez, born in 1610. He enters the priesthood at the age of 17. And he and his fellow priest, Francisco Garape, two idealistic and somewhat naive Roman Catholic missionaries, set out on this brave and grand adventure towards Japan to find out the fate of another missionary who was highly esteemed. Legend had grown, but he had disappeared. His name was Cristavo Ferrara. When they land, they're greeted by Christians who long to have leadership and shepherding and have had none. They also meet a gentleman named Kichijiro, who is a drunk coward, but also becomes a literary foil for a kind of Judas character. And this is important because Shishaku Endo has been lionized, I guess you could say, as delving into the deepest of insights with regards to the role of Judas. Kichijiro helps the missionaries along their way, but he ultimately betrays them, especially Rodriguez, who must painfully endure the torture of his friends and his fellow priests, and see Christians martyred through various means, especially the pit, which I'll explain in a minute, the beheading of some, and then also certain missionaries tied to crosses at the beachheads, and then with rising tides high enough to drown them, they were eventually drowned. But the catch and the escape hatch for these missionaries is the famous Fumi Festival. This is where a large plaque of Christ was put on the ground, and their oppressors and persecutors, the samurai, would try and encourage them to perform an act of sacrilege by stomping on this plaque. And if they would do that, they would be liberated and freed. However, what the priests do not realize, but the reader comes to recognize, is that Ferrara, the disappeared priest for whom they are looking, has actually apostatized already because he could not bear the torture of listening and watching his fellow Christians and missionaries be martyred through unspeakable cruelty the character Inouye, leads the samurai in an attempt to rid the country of Christians by doing the will of the state. In other words, bow down, worship the emperor, or be killed or persecuted. In the pit, a small slit was made behind the ear of missionaries or those being tortured, Christians. Then they were hung upside down and allowed to bleed out, which would take days. And so during the screams of the torture, other missionaries would be forced to watch and to listen as these faithful eventually died. But not Ferrara. Ferrara could not bear that Christians had been tortured, and so he had actually apostatized. And then they discover that this is the case, these missionaries that had gone to find out his faith. Like unto this is somewhat similar what is happening when we return to Babel, the first point on your outline, or Babylon. Return to Babel, you see, was deliberate. You'll see why in a minute. These opening chapters of Daniel hang together. Part of my purpose is for you to have insight into how they hang together. Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 2 were linked by dreams. Daniel 3 and 4 are linked with the image of Nebuchadnezzar. On the one hand, in dreams, in this Colossus statue, and now in chapter 3, as we read about, a statue to which everybody is commanded to bow down. It's easy to see how Daniel 3 holds together as a single story. We could do it isolated from the others, but many of you have probably already heard me on Daniel 1 and 2. Daniel 3 has a beginning and a middle and an end as far as a plot. It creates tension, but eventually it moves towards resolution. There's a striking use of repetitions in this chapter, as you know, undoubtedly noticed. There's a list of the officials over and over again, 4, 7, 29. There is a redundance of the phrase peoples, nations, languages, verse 4, 7, and 29 as well. And then the constant refrain of the musical instruments and the names of the three youths, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, too many verses to mention. And then there's a list of the instruments that seems to have a kind of universal character. It's as if, remember, the audience are believing Hebrews who are in exile, probably by this time Aramaic speaking. And so part of the narrator's purpose is to make these arrogant kings in Babylon look like buffoons, and such was the case with Nebuchadnezzar included. The loquacious and redundant narrator is reminding us, as if we could forget at any moment, that the image is something that Nebuchadnezzar, the king, erected for all peoples to worship and bow down to them. And thereby he mocked the king's attempt to be remembered as the head of gold. A simple outline of the chapter, if you're following along or even taking notes, could be verse 1 to 7. The description of Nebuchadnezzar's gold image. Verses 8 to 12, which describe the accusations of the three friends. Verses 13 to 18 describe the confrontation directly, verse 13 to 18 with Nebuchadnezzar. And verse 19 to 27 describe the miraculous deliverance in the fire. And finally, 28 to 30 describes the confession that Nebuchadnezzar makes after this miraculous deliverance. As I said, there's something universal about this story, just as there was with Babel. Remember the Babel event in Genesis 11. Already in chapter 1, verse 2, if you remember, we had a hint of Babel when 1:2 locates Babylon in the land of Shinar, a direct link to Genesis chapter 11, a backwards allusion, if you will. And just as the incident at Babylon and the arrogance of the people there led to rebellion, even an assault on heaven itself, and then God coming down from heaven and reducing those arrogant people to humility, scattering them over the face of the earth. This is where the plot tension is introduced here. Nebuchadnezzar builds a huge golden statue, insists that everyone, not just the Jews, everyone present bow down and worship it, all peoples, nations, tongues. There's a kind of universality represented here. And as I mentioned, the musical instruments are even given a kind of cosmopolitan feel. So this isn't just a legitimate state, Neo-Babylonian Empire turned bestial. You ought to think about the constant pressures upon states to turn and incline towards being bestial themselves throughout the known world. Let's be clear about one thing. Nowhere in the text does it say that Nebuchadnezzar is merely persecuting the Jews. He's persecuting everybody or trying to bind their conscience, all peoples, all nations, all languages. Esther would be a good contrast to this, the book of Esther. There you remember, it's the Jews particularly that were persecuted. But remember, the Jews are supposed to be monotheists, right? That means, kids, they were supposed to worship the one true God, even as we read about this morning. Their belief in the one God prohibited them from performing such a ritual of bowing down. They were identified here, some, as astrologers. They were probably, in some sense, professional colleagues with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were probably jealous in some sense that these three who had risen so high, so quickly in the Babylonian government should not be allowed to do so. So notice Nebuchadnezzar does not condemn the three Jewish friends specifically for worshiping their God. Nebuchadnezzar condemns them for refusing to worship, literally prostrate themselves before his God and his image. What is it about this kind of megalomania that would cause Nebuchadnezzar to be so enraged? Is this merely the stuff of legend or myth? Or is there something more seismic under the image which Nebuchadnezzar constructs? I think the answer can be found by looking at the kind of slander the three Jewish youths bring. According to the charge in verse 8 to 11, verse 8 literally said, they, that is the accusers, ate their pieces. Now, what in the world does this mean? That's not what your ESV says. Your ESV translates it more paraphrastically, if you will. They maliciously accuse the Jews. But what it literally says is they ate their pieces. They were backbiters. This is a Babylonian, Akkadian, the language of the Babylonians, idiom meaning to maliciously slander. So these men, the charge they brought, have paid no attention to you, O king, verse 12. Your God they do not serve, and the image of gold which you have erected they do not worship. They ate their pieces. They were slandering them. They were backbiters. Perhaps this English idiom goes all the way back to Babylon that we use for slanderous speech. That's why in Psalm 27:2, you will read in your Trinity Psalter hymnal, because it finds its way into our Psalter as well, where the psalmist complains, when evildoers threaten to eat my flesh away. And we sing that in corporate worship. So it's the same exact idiom that comes across. Look, my point is that you notice the contrast between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and these slanderous, backbiting, weak-kneed Chaldeans. What's the narrator doing? He's showing you their character vis-a-vis telling you their character as opposed to telling you their character. This is the high art of narration. He's showing you that these Chaldeans are backbiters and slanderous, whereas the three Jewish youths are being faithful. This is the art of showing rather than telling. You may have heard, as Mark Twain once said, there is no art in conveying the image of a bore, that is, one who is boring, by letting him run on for page after page of dreary dialogue. The art is showing him, that is, allowing the bore to show himself as such in as few words as possible. That's what this narrator, namely Daniel, is doing as well. Both parties had stood before the king, the accusing, slanderous Chaldeans and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The Chaldeans seek to advance themselves. Their loyalties clearly belong to the king. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego absolutely refuse to adopt the king's religious practices. They don't seek to advance themselves, but they do risk not only losing their political station, but losing their very lives. The Chaldeans have nothing to lose, but everything to gain. The Jews, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, have everything to lose and nothing to gain. And whatever the nature of their statue was, whether it's pure gold or gold-plated, the fact of the matter is, notice the particular sin of Nebuchadnezzar here. The statue held together religion and state. It was a conflation of religion and state. And such has been the case in our modern era as well as in the ancient world. As Herr Baldur von Schirach declared in 1936, to refresh your memory on history, that's as the Third Reich was rising to power and Hitler was gaining accession. He said, one cannot be a good German and at the same time deny God. But an arousal of faith in the eternal German is at the same time an arousal of faith in the eternal God. If we act as true Germans, we act according to the laws of God. Whoever serves Adolf Hitler, the Führer, serves Germany, and whoever serves Germany serves God. Now there's rank, bald nationalism on steroids. Many who reflected on the Holocaust in Germany saw this dynamic at play, namely nationalism on steroids. That, for example, is why Martin Buber, a Jew, 5 years after this newspaper declaration, would say, every nation is inclined to make an idol of its own inner spirit. Israel's calling was to erect a throne to God rather than to itself. And that is why every nation is bound to desire to get rid of us, that is Israel. At the time, it is in the act of setting up itself as the only absolute. Therefore, Nebuchadnezzar sets before them either or option. Do this or die. Die or bow down to my statue. They, point number 2, are resigned to die. Nebuchadnezzar has the 3 Hebrew youths, men, brought before him and asks, is it true that you refuse to worship this statue of Nebuchadnezzar? And then with utter audacity, Nebuchadnezzar says in verse 15b, the climax, the first climax of the narrative, who is the God who can deliver you out of my hand? Who is a God who can deliver you out of my hand? That's the climactic focal point so far. Death, though, is preferable to apostasy for these 3 youths. And so they respond to the king. Verse 16 to 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, we have no need with respect to this matter to make a defense before you. If our God, whom we worship, is able to save us from the fiery furnace and from your hand, O king, he will save us. But if he is not, let it be known to you, O king, that your God we are not serving, and to the image of gold which you have set up, we will not bow down. Now, the translation here, as several in the room know, is a difficult one indeed, because it seems to imply a doubt as to the ability of God to deliver from the furnace, if taken literally on the lips of these 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Many people have misunderstood this passage syntactically throughout the centuries. take one example of a writer who says, "Oh, it can hardly be that such strong champions of their God would, for a moment, admit that he was unable to deliver them. And to do that to a heathen king? They could admit the possibility of his not intervening to save them, but not his inability to save them." Well, I would suggest that the underlying presupposition there is moralism. That's not true to the text. People try and do all kinds of gymnastics with the text, either by bluntly changing it or finding other possibilities. Rather, as I said years ago and would still say, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are examples of the altar people in every age. Not peculiar or special, except perhaps in the degree of severe circumstances in which they find themselves. They are mere humans. And although they are gifted and talented Jewish youth, nevertheless, they are mere men. And moreover, they are Jews in exile, in the early stages of exile. And thus, their faith is weak, as it was. But it takes on new significance in this light, because power must be perfected through their weakness. This is the theology of pilgrims. The notion is rather, if God in his sovereign good pleasure, our God, can deliver us, he will do so. Remember how extremely difficult it was, the exile for our Jewish forefathers? It's clear that the experience of judgment led to a sensation of disorientation, discontinuity with the past, a radical break with the past for our Jewish forefathers. And therefore, we must think of these three young men precisely, not thinking too highly or too lowly of them. They were men of principle. To repeat the noble writing of one, says, "This is the religion of principle." And when we consider the circumstances of those who made this reply, when we remember their comparative youth and the few opportunities which they had for instruction in the nature of religion, and that they were captive in a strange land, and that they stood before the most absolute monarch of the entire earth, no powerful friends to support them, the most horrid kind of death threatening them, we may well admire the grace that God, who could so amply furnish them for such a trial, and love the religion which enabled them to take a stand so noble and so bold. You see, these men were deeply concerned about one question. The question the founder of this church states, how can I be right with God in this situation? That's the most important question that any human being can ask while they have life breath. J.G. Machen went on to say, well, there's men who are not interested in that question, but they are not the kind of men that change history. As he continues to say, the beginning of true nobility comes when a man ceases to be interested in the judgment of men and becomes interested in the judgment of God alone. And thus the first climax of the story is found right here. Nebuchadnezzar's throwing his temper tantrum, and they respond accordingly. But it doesn't stop with this climax. We have another one, point 3, rescue in the fire. Now the king, who thought that there was no God who could save these confessors from his hand, remember he asked the question, who is a God who can save you from my hand? Now he perceives God's intervention. Now we're ready. Everything's in place. Now notice the various loyalties talked about before seem to complicate a kind of simple retribution statement. Namely, the wicked get their comeuppance, the righteous get theirs. Rather, what we have is the loyal, allegedly dutiful courtiers, the Chaldeans, now suffering. And we build to a pause. And we try and take in everything that has happened. And our thoughts turn to the three men. And we look, oh, there's not 3, there's 4. We'd expected 3, or hoped for, a deliverance from the fire. But interesting, now we see a deliverance in the fire. It's interesting in the scriptures how often appearances of God are associated with fire. Exodus 3, Numbers 16, and other places. So now we backtrack to the furnace, and we see the repetition. Blazing, burning, fiery furnace has been foreshadowing all along what would be absolutely central in the upcoming narrative, namely verses 25 to 26, Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. Now he, Nebuchadnezzar, answered and said, "Behold, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and there's no harm upon them, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." And then Nebuchadnezzar drew near to the door of the furnace of the burning fire, and he answered and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High, come out." And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out from the midst of the fire. Notice, brothers and sisters, the rescue is not from the fire, but in the fire. And in verse 26, the Aramaic, as I have rendered it, says that the 4th was like a son of the gods. Now, the King James Version rendered it son of God. That's actually not grammatically defensible. Indeed, some in the early church did interpret this as a pre-incarnate appearance of the second person of the Trinity. However, did you notice in verse 28? He's not called a son of God. He's called an angel. God or angel, it doesn't really make much difference. After all, God often appears and is described in angelic terms in the Old Testament. What matters is the text describes Emmanuel. God is with us. The text now continues to describe no harm came to them. There wasn't even a whiff of smoke on them. A miracle had been witnessed. And it is at just this point that Paul's immortal words find their homecoming in the language of Bhaktin. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation? Shall distress? Shall persecution? Shall famine? Shall nakedness? Danger? Sword? As it is written, for your sake, we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded to be as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us, Romans 8. God's presence comes in the fire, not being preserved from the furnace. Once again, you remember the initial question I asked months ago. Is God still present with his people in exile? This story reaffirms absolutely. Conclusion. You know, there's been many martyrs throughout the history of the church whose behavior has not only been intrepid, but heroic. Think of the first martyr of the Christian church. Who was it? An elder? No, a deacon. That's right. It was Stephen, and therefore the office of deacon has great nobility attributed to it. Think of the bishops, 3, Latimer, Ridley, and Cranmer, who were all burned at the stake of Oxford during the so-called Rule of Bloody Mary from 1553 to 1558. Latimer, in an effort to encourage his comrade just before the flames licked up to his body, said, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle by God's good grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." Or closer to our own time, our first OPC missionary. Do you know who that was? Bruce Hunt. In 1931, the Japanese invaded Manchuria, and the conditions for believers grew very, very grim. Reverend Hunt was a missionary to the Korean-speaking people in the city of Harbin in Manchuria. He was one of the few Christian missionaries who used the Korean language in speaking to his Korean brothers and sisters, telling them not to offer worship to any but the true and living God. No emperor worship should a Christian participate in. Therefore, he openly opposed believers participating in Shinto acts of worship. And he spent many, many, many months in prison for this. Where do Christians ultimately derive the strength and courage to make such a stand? Ultimately from Jesus, of course. But note how very different every martyr's death is from Jesus. Remember, Christian, it was Jesus Christ himself who was put on trial before royalty for claiming to be the Messiah. Facing death, he too refused to capitulate, Matthew 27. Jesus was brought before the governor. The governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You said so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. And then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" He gave them no answer, not even to a single charge. So the governor was amazed. However, Jesus' death was no mere martyr's death. No comfort came to him. It might even fill us with horror and terror because the holiest man ever to live was God-forsaken. All the truths of Revelation to the 10th power were poured out on Christ on the cross because he was the wrath bearer. He was God-forsaken. Jesus' death was much, much more than a mere martyr's death. Beloved Christians, these forefathers found the moral strength to make courageous stands because they knew God was with them. Despite so many complaints in North America about infringements on our religious liberties, rarely is anyone in North America confronted with these kinds of decisions presently. Doesn't mean we won't be in the future, but not presently. Nevertheless, as John Calvin provocatively stated, the human mind is indeed a factory of idols. And we are constantly faced with temptations against idolatry, whether of Nebuchadnezzar's sort, rare for us in our country, or more likely the kinds of idols we discover in our own hearts, which ultimately have one object: self. For so many in our culture, especially in North America, when all the masks are ripped away, behind every idol is the self, enthroned and attempting to make meaning in our lives. But the point of Daniel 3 is ultimately to teach us that we must not only resist all forms of idolatry external, whether the extreme in Nebuchadnezzar's sort or some other kind of subtle kind that we discover in our own hearts, but that we must be prepared to resist it, even to the point of death, whether in ourselves or outside ourselves. Therefore, I close with the words of the writer to Hebrews, chapter 12. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostilities, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for your word that is sharper than any two-edged sword. We ask again that you would make us teachable and that we would respond to your word with humility and grace, and that we would grow according to your Spirit. Help us to that end, we do pray. Amen.